Sign it, or I'll let them break your legs first. The voice of Sana's uncle was a jagged blade, cutting through the freezing air of the abandoned warehouse. Sana looked down at the marriage contract, her vision blurred by hot, stinging tears. She was only 19, an orphan who hadn't even had time to process the grief of losing her parents, and yet she had become the only currency left to pay for a debt she didn't create. Across from her sat Lee Tae-jun. They called him the Viper of Soul. His sharp, angular jawline was as lethal as the criminal empire he ruled, and his steady, intent eyes tracked the frantic tremble in Sana's hands. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like an executioner waiting for the final signal to strike. "Please," Sana whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "I don't even know him." Her uncle didn't care. He reached out, his fingers clawing toward her hair to force her head down toward the ink. But before he could touch a single strand of her dark hair, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the hollow room. It was the sound of Tae-jun's hand slamming onto the table. "Touch her again," Tae-jun rasped, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that turned the very air in the room to ice. "And you won't live long enough to see the first payment." The room went deathly silent. Sana's family, the people who were supposed to be her blood, glanced at each other, their greed momentarily masked by pure terror. They thought they were selling her into a life of torture to save their own skins. They'd whispered for weeks that she would be a toy for a monster, a broken girl in a golden cage. Sana believed them. She expected a nightmare of blood and iron. What they didn't know yet was that the most dangerous man in Korea had been watching Sana Whitmore from the shadows for years. They didn't know that the Viper had been waiting for this exact moment to claim what he believed was his. And her family. They had no idea that by giving her to him, they just handed a flamethrower to the man who was about to burn their entire world to the ground. Wait until you see what happens when her uncle realizes he didn't sell a slave. He created a queen. Hello, family. Welcome back to Afro-Glow Mafia Tales. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot to us. Now let's go back into the story. The rain in the city didn't wash things clean. It only turned the soot of the slums into a thick, suffocating gray. For Sana Whitmore, the world had turned gray the moment the soil hit her parents' coffins. She stood in the middle of their cramped living room, her deep brown skin pale with exhaustion, staring at the empty spaces where her mother's favorite vases used to sit. Her parents had been gone for only 3 days, but the scavengers had already arrived. "They owed us, Sana. It's only fair," her uncle Elias grunted, tossing a stack of her father's old records into a cardboard box. He didn't look at her. None of them did. To her aunts and cousins, Sana was no longer a niece or a sister. She was a liability attached to a mountain of debt. The debt was a murky, terrifying thing. Her father had been a hardworking man, but in the final months of his life, he had become desperate to keep their small business afloat. He had gone to the wrong people, the kind of people who charged interest in blood. Now, those people were knocking on the door, and her family was more than happy to throw Sana out to greet them if it meant saving their own property. "You can't sell the house, Uncle," Sana said, her voice small but steady. "It's all I have left of them." Elias stopped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, ugly heat. "The house is gone, girl. The bank took it an hour ago. The only thing you have left is a debt that's going to get us all killed unless we find a way to pay it." He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "There's a man, a powerful man from the city. He's seen you, Sana. He's willing to wipe the slate clean if you become his wife. It's a mercy. You'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly." Sana felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. She knew the rumors of the man her uncle was talking about. Lee Tae-jun, the Viper of Soul. A man who controlled the city's pulse from a glass tower, whose name was whispered in fear by the very men who were currently threatening her family. "I won't do it," she whispered, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I'm 19. I'm not a piece of property to be traded." Elias laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "You think you have a choice? Look out the window, Sana." She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. Parked at the curb was a fleet of black sedans, their tinted windows reflecting the bleak afternoon sky. Standing beside them were men in sharp, dark suits, their faces like stone. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to collect. Sana realized then that her family hadn't just made a suggestion. They had already signed her life away. The inheritance her parents left her wasn't a home or a future. It was a cage of ashes, and the man who held the key was already waiting for her in the dark. The transition from the world Sana knew to the world of Lee Taejun happened with a violent, surgical speed. There was no time for goodbyes to the empty rooms of her childhood home, and certainly no comfort to be found in the eyes of her relatives. Her uncle, Elias, had practically shoved her toward the black sedan, his hands trembling, not with grief, but with the frantic relief of a man who had just traded a life for his own safety. As the car door thudded shut, the sound was final. It was the sound of a lid closing on a casket. Sana sat huddled in the backseat, her slim frame looking impossibly small against the expensive leather upholstery. She stared out the tinted window as the familiar, crumbling brickwork of her neighborhood vanished, replaced by the gleaming, heartless glass of the city's upper district. Beside her sat two men who hadn't spoken a word since they forced her into the vehicle. They were statues in tailored suits, their presence a constant reminder that she was no longer a person, but a high-value asset being transported to its new owner. The car wound its way up a private, winding road lined with ancient pines that seemed to lean over the path like silent sentinels. Finally, the iron gates of the Taejun estate groaned open. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a fortress of white stone and dark steel, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the gray sprawl of Seoul. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that felt like a warning. When the car stopped, the door was opened by a man who bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Sana stepped out, her legs feeling like water. Her breath hitched in the cold mountain air. She expected to be dragged to a dungeon or a cold bedroom, but instead, she was led through a foyer that stretched toward a ceiling of hand-painted murals and crystal chandeliers. "The master is in the study," one of the guards said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are expected." Sana was led down a long, echoing hallway where the walls were adorned with traditional Korean ink paintings, dragons and tigers stalking through mist. At the end of the hall stood a set of heavy double doors made of dark walnut. The guard knocked once and opened them, stepping aside to let her pass. The study was bathed in the warm, orange glow of a fireplace, but the heat didn't reach the man sitting behind the massive desk. Lee Taejun didn't look up immediately. He was focused on a series of documents, a fountain pen moving with elegant, lethal precision across the pages. In the flickering light, his sharp, angular jawline looked as though it had been carved from obsidian. He was younger than Sana had imagined, but his aura carried the weight of 1,000 years of cold authority. Sana stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her tattered black dress. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight, pressing the air out of her lungs. Finally, Taejun laid the pen down. He looked up, and for the first time, Sana felt the full force of the viper's gaze. His eyes weren't the eyes of a monster, which made them even more terrifying. They were steady, intent, and impossibly deep, as if he were reading not just her face, but the very secrets she had buried in her soul. "You're shaking," he said. His voice was a low, dominant vibration that seemed to hum in the very floorboards beneath her feet. I don't want to be here," Sana whispered, her voice cracking. "My uncle, Your uncle is a coward who traded his blood for a ledger entry," Taejun interrupted, his tone as sharp as a razor. He rose from his chair, his athletic, muscular frame unfolding with a predatory grace. He walked around the desk, moving toward her with a slow, deliberate gait that made Sana want to bolt for the door. He stopped just inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and something cold, like rain on steel, enveloped her. He was nearly a foot taller than her, his broad shoulders blocking out the light of the fire. "You think you've been brought here to be punished," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the small, silver locket around her neck, the only thing her mother had left her. "You think I am the nightmare your family whispered about." Sana looked up at him, her deep brown eyes wide with a mixture of defiance and terror. "Aren't you? They say you break everything you touch." A ghost of a smile, dark and dangerous, flickered across Taejun's lips. He reached out and Sana flinched, expecting a blow. But his hand didn't strike her. Instead, he gently tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. His touch was warm, a startling contrast to the coldness of his reputation. "I break things that are meant to be broken," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you You are not one of them." He turned away, walking toward the large window that overlooked the city. "There is a room prepared for you in the East Wing. It has everything you require. You will not be disturbed unless I summon you. You are my wife now, Sana. In this house, your word is law to everyone but me." "And if I try to leave?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jun didn't turn around. He watched her reflection in the glass, his expression unreadable. "You won't leave. Not because of the guards or the gates or the debt. You won't leave because, for the first time in your life, you are in the only place where no one can hurt you." He gestured to the door, a silent dismissal. As Sana backed out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, she couldn't help but feel that she hadn't just entered a prison. She had entered a trap, one lined with velvet and gold, set by a man who looked at her not with cruelty, but with an obsession that was far more dangerous. The first week in the East Wing felt less like a marriage and more like a fever dream. Sana lived in a suite that was larger than her parents' entire apartment, a space of silk sheets, heated marble floors, and a balcony that looked out over the mist-shrouded peaks of the Buckhanson Mountains. But the luxury felt like a heavy shroud. She spent her days wandering the vast, silent corridors, her footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs, waiting for the viper to strike. She expected the cruelty the world had promised. She expected to be summoned to his bed, or made to scrub the floors, or berated for her family's failures. But Lee Jun remained a ghost in his own home. He was a man of shadows and silence, appearing only at dinner, where he sat at the head of a table so long they had to raise their voices to be heard. He never raised his. He watched her eat with a clinical, detached intensity, his dark eyes tracking every movement of her fork. He didn't ask her about her day. He didn't offer comfort. He simply existed in her space like a dormant volcano, beautiful and terrifyingly still. On the 5th night, the silence was broken. Sana was in the library, a 2-story cathedral of leather-bound books and rolling ladders, trying to find a distraction from the grief that still sat like a stone in her chest. She reached for a book on the top shelf, but her fingers slipped. The heavy volume crashed to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the still house. Panic surged through her. She scrambled to pick it up, her heart hammering. In her uncle's house, a broken dish or a dropped book was met with a stinging slap or a week of chores. She expected a roar of anger, but when she turned, Jun was already standing in the doorway. He hadn't made a sound as he approached. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched the book to her chest. "It was an accident. I'll fix it, Sana." His voice was a low, dominant vibration that cut through her frantic apologies. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He took the book from her hands and set it on a side table without even looking at the title. He didn't yell. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You are trembling over a piece of paper and glue," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Is that what they did to you? Did they make you afraid of mistakes?" Sana looked down at her feet, her deep brown skin flushing. I don't know what the rules are here." "There is only one rule," Jun said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest. "Do not lie to me. Everything else is negotiable." He let go of her hand, but the warmth of his touch lingered like a brand. Before she could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted instantly. The slight softness vanished, replaced by a mask of lethal, jagged ice. "Stay here," he commanded. He walked out of the library, but he didn't close the door all the way. Driven by a sudden, reckless curiosity, Sana crept toward the hallway. She saw Jun standing at the end of the corridor, speaking to a man in a dark suit, his head of security. "They're at the gate again," Jun asked, his voice now a serrated blade. "Yes, master. Your wife's uncle, Elias. He's demanding more money. He says the merchandise was worth more than the initial debt. He's threatening to go to the press about the kidnapping if you don't pay up." Sana felt the blood drain from her face. Her uncle. Even after selling her, he was trying to squeeze more profit out of her misery. She waited for Jun to agree, to pay the man off, or perhaps to throw her out to settle the new demand. Instead, Jun let out a low, dark laugh that made the hair on the back of Sana's neck stand up. "He thinks he can bargain with me using her name. He thinks he has the right to speak of her at all." Jun turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the dim hallway lights. "Tell the men at the gate to let him in, but not to the house. Take him to the garden pavilion, and bring my blade. I want him to understand exactly what happens to people who try to sell what I have already claimed." "Master, the girl might hear," the guard cautioned. "Let her hear," Jun rasped. "She needs to understand that the world she came from no longer exists. Her uncle didn't come here to negotiate. He came here to commit suicide. He just doesn't know it yet." Sana pulled back into the shadows of the library, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She had wanted to see the cruel master, and now she had. But as she heard his heavy footsteps receding toward the garden, she realized the cruelty wasn't directed at her. For the first time in 19 years, the monster wasn't under her bed or at her dinner table. The monster was standing at the gate, protecting her. And he was about to show her family that the viper didn't just bite, he swallowed his enemies whole. The silence that followed Jun's departure was heavier than the one that had preceded it. Sana stood frozen in the library, the scent of old paper and leather suddenly cloying. Her heart felt like a trapped bird beating against the bars of her ribs. She knew her uncle was a greedy, desperate man, but the idea of Jun's justice filled her with a primal, sickening dread. Driven by a force she couldn't name, Sana moved. She didn't head for her room in the east wing. Instead, she slipped out of the library and followed the dim, amber-lit corridors toward the rear of the mansion. The garden pavilion was a structure of glass and dark wood, perched over a koi pond that glowed with artificial blue light. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she saw them. Jun was sitting in a low chair, his posture relaxed, almost bored. His suit jacket was off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with dark, intricate tattoos. Across from him, her uncle Elias was sweating, his face a mottled purple as he gestured wildly with his hands. Sana couldn't hear the words, but the body language was unmistakable. Elias was demanding, pushing, leaning in with the false bravado of a man who thought he held a winning hand. Jun didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply watched Elias with the terrifying stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. Suddenly, Jun leaned forward. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that Sana blinked and nearly missed it. He grabbed Elias by the front of his shirt and slammed him onto the low table between them. The sound of glass cracking echoed even through the closed doors. Sana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw Jun pull a short, curved blade from a sheath at his belt, a karambit. Its blade gleaming like a silver tooth in the moonlight. He didn't strike. Instead, he pressed the flat of the blade against Elias' throat, leaning in to whisper something directly into his ear. Elias' eyes widened, his struggle instantly ceasing as his face went pale. He began to shake, his lips moving in what looked like frantic pleas. Jun watched him for a long moment, then slowly, almost casually, he used the tip of the blade to slice the top button off Elias' shirt. With a flick of his wrist, Jun released him. Elias scrambled backward, falling off the pavilion steps and onto the gravel path. He didn't look back. He ran toward the gates like a man who had seen the mouth of hell opening beneath his feet. Jun stood up, wiping the blade on a silk cloth before sheathing it. He turned his head toward the mansion, his gaze unerringly finding the window where Sana stood hidden in the shadows. He didn't look angry. He looked expectant. Sana backed away, her breath coming in shallow hitches, but before she could flee, the door to the pavilion wing opened. Jun walked in, the cold night air clinging to his clothes. He stopped when he saw her standing in the center of the hallway, her deep brown skin looking ashen under the halogen lights. "You watched," he said. It wasn't a question. "You were going to kill him," Sana whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and a strange, confusing relief. "I was going to show him the price of his greed," Jun corrected, his voice returning to that low, dominant vibration. He stepped closer, and this time, Sana didn't flinch. She was too exhausted by the fear to move. "Your uncle believes you are an object he can rent out whenever his pockets are empty. He believes he still has a claim on your life." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he let it drop. "He is wrong. No one touches what is mine, Sana. Not your family, not the debt collectors, not the shadows in your head. Do you understand?" "Why?" Sana asked, her eyes searching his for some sign of the monster everyone said he was. Why go through all this for an orphan girl you don't even know? T-June's expression shifted, a flicker of something raw and intensely personal breaking through his icy mask. He stepped into her personal space, the heat from his body acting as a silent demand for her attention. You think this is about a debt? He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear that had escaped her eye. The touch was surprisingly tender, his calloused skin rough against her cheek. I've known your name for 3 years, Sana. I knew your father's books were failing before he did. I knew your uncle was a snake before he ever bit you. Sana's breath caught. You planned this. I waited for this, T-June whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. I gave your family every opportunity to protect you. They failed. I am the only thing standing between you and the wolves now, Sana, and I have no intention of letting you go. He turned and walked toward his study, leaving her standing in the hallway. Sana looked at her hands, still shaking, and realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just afraid of the man who had just chased her uncle away. She was afraid of the way her heart had leaped when he touched her. The Viper wasn't just protecting her from her family. He was claiming her, piece by piece, and for the first time since her parents died, Sana felt a dangerous, terrifying sense of belonging. The revelation in the hallway left Sana reeling. The idea that her life hadn't been a series of tragic accidents, but a path monitored by the most dangerous man in the city, made the walls of the mansion feel like they were closing in. Every luxury, every silk thread, and every polished stone now felt like a part of a sophisticated trap. For 3 days, she avoided him. She took her meals in her room and kept the doors locked, but the Viper didn't force his way in. He simply let her simmer in her own thoughts, his presence felt only through the silent, constant care of the staff. However, the curiosity, the need to know the depth of the shadow he had cast over her, finally became stronger than her fear. On a rainy Thursday evening, while T-June was reportedly at a meeting in the city, Sana found herself in the West Wing. This part of the house was strictly off-limits, a place where the guards stood a little straighter and the air felt a little colder. She moved like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the dark wood floors. At the end of a long gallery, she found a door without a handle. It was flush with the wall, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. Remembering the biometric scanners she had seen in the study, she reached out, but to her surprise, the door clicked open at her touch. It wasn't locked. It was as if it had been waiting for her. The room inside was not a cold office or a high-tech surveillance hub. It was a studio. The walls were covered in sketches, thousands of them. Some were charcoal, some were vibrant oils, and others were quick pencil gestures. As Sana stepped further into the room, her breath hitched. Every single piece of art featured her. There was a sketch of her at 16, sitting on the steps of her high school with a book in her lap. There was an oil painting of her at 18, laughing in the rain outside her parents' bakery. There were even sketches of her from the funeral, captured in moments of raw, private grief she thought no one had seen. The level of detail was haunting. He hadn't just watched her. He had studied the way the light hit her deep brown skin, the specific curve of her smile, and the way her eyes changed color when she was deep in thought. It was an archive of a life he had lived alongside her from the shadows. I didn't think you'd find this place so soon. Sana spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. T-June was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He looked tired, his tie loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. You've been stalking me, Sana whispered, her voice trembling as she backed away from a painting that looked so real it felt like her own reflection was watching her. For years. This isn't protection, T-June. It's a sickness. T-June didn't flinch at her words. He walked into the room, his presence instantly shrinking the space. He stopped in front of a charcoal drawing of Sana looking out a window. It's obsession, he corrected calmly. I don't deny that. When I first saw you, I was a man who believed the world was made of nothing but ash and stone. Then I saw you, and for the first time I felt the weight of my own soul. He turned to her, his gaze intense. I didn't cause your parents' debt, Sana. I didn't cause the accident. But I made sure that when your world fell apart, I was the only net beneath you. I have waited 3 years to hear your voice in my house. Do you have any idea what that does to a man like me? Sana felt a terrifying mixture of repulsion and a strange, dark allure. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had built a shrine to her existence. He had seen her in her most vulnerable moments, and instead of exploiting her, he had worshipped her. "You're a killer," she said, her voice stronger now. "You're the Viper." "I am," he agreed, stepping closer until he was looming over her. "And as the Viper, I have spent millions to ensure no one else ever hurt you. I have destroyed men who looked at you the wrong way. I have cleared a path for you to walk on, and I would do it again 1,000 times over." He reached out, his hand hesitating before he gently cupped her jaw. His touch was electric, a spark that traveled through her entire body. "You are free to hate me, Sana. You are free to call me a monster, but you will stay. You will let me give you the life your parents wanted for you. And one day, you will realize that the only person in this world who truly sees you is the man everyone else is afraid to look at." Sana looked up at him, her chest heaving. The room, filled with her own face, felt like a testament to a fate she couldn't escape. She realized then that she wasn't just his wife by contract. She was his heart's sole prisoner, and the scariest part wasn't the room full of drawings. It was the fact that she was starting to want to stay. The transition from the hidden studio to the public stage was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Taejun no longer kept Sana in the shadows of the East Wing. Instead, he began to weave her into the very fabric of his life, but he did it with a lavish, aggressive generosity that left her breathless. It started with the closet transition. One morning, Sana woke to find her modest wardrobe replaced. In its place was a sea of silk, cashmere, and high-fashion labels she had only ever seen in the glossy magazines discarded in her parents' bakery. There were gowns in deep emerald and burnished gold that complemented her skin perfectly, and shoes that cost more than her uncle's car. "The master has requested your presence for a trip into the city," the head maid, Mrs. Han, whispered with a bow. "A car is waiting." When Sana stepped out of the mansion, she found Taejun leaning against a matte black Lamborghini. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his presence so commanding it seemed to pull the sunlight toward him. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the way the gold fabric of her dress caught the light. He didn't say she looked beautiful. He simply opened the door and said, "We have much to reclaim." The day was a blur of extreme privilege. They arrived at the most exclusive department store in Gangnam, a place where the doors were usually guarded by men in white gloves. As they stepped inside, the manager didn't just greet them. He cleared the floor. "The store is closed for the next 3 hours, Taejun stated, his voice cool and indifferent to the chaos he was causing. Sana watched in shock as rows of staff lined up, holding trays of champagne and rare jewels. For 3 hours, she was the only woman in the building. Taejun sat in a plush velvet chair, watching her as if she were the only thing in the room worth seeing. He didn't check price tags. He simply pointed at anything that made her eyes brighten even for a second. "Taejun, this is too much," she whispered, leaning over a display of diamond-encrusted watches. "I don't need all of this." "It isn't about need," he replied, standing up and walking toward her. He picked up a necklace, a delicate string of black diamonds, and fastened it around her neck. His fingers were cool against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "It's about the world knowing that Sana Whitmore is no longer the girl they can pity. You are the woman they will envy." As they left the store, the street was lined with onlookers and paparazzi. Sana instinctively flinched at the flashing lights, her past trauma of being hounded by debt collectors resurfacing. But before the panic could take root, Taejun's arm was around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. His body felt like a wall of solid muscle, a shield against the world. He didn't hide his face. He looked directly into the cameras, his expression one of cold, possessive pride. He was sending a message to the syndicate, to her family, and to the city. She belongs to the Viper, and she is untouchable. The day ended at a private rooftop restaurant overlooking the Han River. As the sun set, painting the water in shades of violet and orange, Taejun handed her a small, leather-bound folder. Sana opened it and gasped. Inside were the deeds to her parents' bakery and their family home. They had been bought back from the bank, but the names on the deeds weren't Lee Taejun or Elias Vance. "They are in your name, Sana," he said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "The bakery is being renovated. It will be whatever you want it to be, a library, a cafe, or just a memory you own." Sana looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. For 19 years, she had been a victim of circumstance, a girl moved around by the whims of cruel men. Now, the most dangerous man of all was handing her back her own life, piece by piece. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You could have kept me as a prisoner. You could have made me feel the debt every single day." Jun reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His thumb traced the line of her pulse, which was racing under his touch. "I don't want a prisoner, Sana. I told you before, I've watched you for 3 years. I didn't fall in love with a girl who was broken. I fell in love with a girl who stayed soft in a world that tried to turn her to stone." He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I'm not spoiling you to buy your love. I'm spoiling you so that you finally realize you are worth more than any debt. And if I have to buy the whole city to prove that to you, then I will." Sana looked out at the city lights, feeling the weight of the diamonds at her neck and the warmth of his hand on hers. She realized then that the Viper wasn't just obsessed with her safety. He was obsessed with her happiness. And as much as it terrified her, she was starting to realize that she didn't want to be anywhere else but by his side. The higher Sana rose in Jun's world, the longer the shadows became beneath her. In the brutal hierarchy of the soul underworld, a man's strength was measured by his lack of attachments. For years, Jun had been an untouchable ghost because he had nothing to lose. Now, by draping Sana in diamonds and parading her through Gangnam, he had given his enemies a target, a beautiful, breathing heartbeat that sat right outside his ribcage. The tension within the syndicate began as a low hum. Jun's primary lieutenant, Park Jae-hoon, a man with eyes as cold as a winter morning and a heart made of calculated ambition, watched from the corners of the mansion. He saw the way the Viper looked at the girl. He saw the millions flowing into sentimental investments like bakeries and orphanages. To Jae-hoon, this wasn't love, it was a terminal illness. "The council is asking questions, Master," Jae-hoon said one evening in the study, his voice a respectful silk that hid a serrated edge. "They see the gifts. They see the closed department stores. They wonder if the Viper has traded his fangs for a wedding ring." Jun didn't even look up from the ledger he was reading. "The council exists because I allow them to. If they have questions about my wife, they can bring them to me personally. But they should be prepared to leave their tongues behind." Jae-hoon bowed, his face a mask of obedience, but as he stepped out of the room, he signaled to the men waiting in the hall. The plan was already in motion. If Jun wouldn't remove the distraction, the syndicate would do it for him. The following afternoon, Sana felt a strange restlessness. Jun was at the docks overseeing a shipment, and for the first time he had left her with a reduced security detail, trusting the fortress-like walls of the estate. Restless, she decided to visit the garden pavilion to clear her head. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was heavy, but the usual peaceful silence of the grounds felt hollow. She was halfway down the stone path when the first black van breached the secondary gate. Sana froze. These weren't Jun's men. They didn't move with his disciplined grace. They moved with the frantic, jagged energy of street soldiers. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth. The scent of cheap tobacco and grease filled her senses as she was hoisted off the ground. "Don't struggle, little queen," a voice hissed in her ear. "You're worth more than your weight in gold to the men who want to see your husband bleed." She was shoved into the back of the van, the world disappearing as a hood was pulled over her head. The drive felt like an eternity, a series of sharp turns and sudden stops that left her disoriented. When the hood was finally ripped off, she wasn't in a warehouse or a dungeon. She was in an abandoned shipyard, the skeletal remains of rusted vessels looming over her like prehistoric beasts. Jae-hoon stood before her, his charcoal suit looking out of place against the grime. He looked at Sana not with hate, but with a terrifying, clinical indifference. "You are a very expensive mistake, Sana," he said, packing in front of the chair where she was tied. "Jun thinks he can have it all, power and peace, but a king cannot have a heart. It makes him slow, it makes him soft." "He'll kill you for this," Sana spat, her voice raw but defiant. Despite the terror, she felt a strange, new fire in her chest, the fire Jun had spent weeks stoking by telling her she was worth protecting. Jae-hoon laughed, a dry sound that was swallowed by the wind. "He will try, and that is exactly why we brought you here. He's coming for you right now, alone, just as we knew he would. He's discarded every protocol, left his army behind, all to save one girl. He leaned in close, his eyes reflecting the cold gray of the sky. By the time he realizes this is an ambush, you'll both be at the bottom of the Han River. The syndicate needs a leader, not a lover. Sana's heart plummeted. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her presence wasn't just a joy for T-June, it was his greatest vulnerability. He was walking into a trap because of her. For the first time, she didn't fear for her own life. She feared for the man who had looked at thousands of sketches of her face and seen his only reason to live. The sound of a lone engine roared in the distance. Cutting through the silence of the shipyard, Jae-hoon smiled, drawing a heavy pistol from his waistband. The Viper has arrived. Let's see if he still knows how to bite. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted iron and shattered dreams, but for Lee T-June, it was a hunting ground. The lone roar of his engine died out, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had turned to lead. Jae-hoon stood over Sana, his pistol pressed against her temple, his finger twitching on the trigger. He expected a desperate man to come charging through the gates. He expected a husband pleading for his wife's life. He didn't expect the shadows to start screaming. The first of Jae-hoon's snipers fell from a rusted crane, his body hitting the concrete with a sickening thud. No gunshot had been heard, only the whistle of a pressurized dart. Then, the lights in the shipyard flickered and died, plunging the rusted labyrinth into total darkness. T-June, Jae-hoon roared, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp edge of panic. I know you're here, one step closer and she dies. From the darkness, a voice emerged. It wasn't the voice of the man who had tucked Sana into silk sheets or whispered about bakeries. It was a cold, distorted rasp that seemed to come from every direction at once. You said love made me soft, Jae-hoon, the voice echoed, vibrating through the metal ribs of the ships. You said a heart makes a king slow, but you forgot one thing. A man with nothing to lose is a danger. A man with everything to protect is a god. A flare suddenly ignited in the center of the yard, bathing the area in a harsh, flickering red light. T-June stood 50 feet away, but he wasn't alone. He had moved through the shipyard like a ghost, leaving a trail of unconscious or dead traitors in his wake. He was dressed in a tactical black combat suit, his face a mask of such terrifying, focused rage that even the seasoned killers around Jae-hoon began to back away. Drop the gun, T-June commanded. He wasn't holding a pistol. He held a long, traditional Korean blade, a H1 its steel reflecting the red glow of the flare. Kill her, Jae-hoon screamed to his remaining men. But the men didn't move. One by one, red laser dots appeared on their chests. T-June hadn't come alone. He had brought the only soldiers in the syndicate who were still loyal to the blood oath, not the paycheck. T-June moved. It was a blur of kinetic violence. He bridged the distance between them with the speed of a strike. The blade flashed in the red light, a silver arc that disarmed the nearest guard before he could even draw breath. T-June didn't stop. He moved through the guards with a rhythmic, lethal precision, his movements a symphony of bone-breaking force and whispered steel. Sana watched, her eyes wide, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the Viper in his true form. He was a whirlwind of retribution, a man who had become a monster specifically so that she would never have to see one again. Jae-hoon panicked. He turned the gun away from Sana to aim at the approaching silhouette of T-June, but he was too slow. T-June's hand clamped around Jae-hoon's wrist, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the yard. The pistol clattered to the floor. T-June didn't kill him immediately. He slammed the lieutenant against a rusted shipping container, his hand tightening around Jae-hoon's throat. You touched her, T-June whispered, his eyes glowing with a dark, predatory light. You put a hood over the eyes I worship. You put a rope around the wrists I've spent weeks healing. Please, Jae-hoon wheezed. There is no please for you, T-June rasped. He delivered a strike that sent Jae-hoon into unconsciousness, leaving him for his men to deal with. The Viper didn't care about the coup anymore. He didn't care about the syndicate. He turned to Sana. In an instant, the monster vanished. He dropped the blade and scrambled toward her, his hands trembling as he sliced through her ropes. He pulled her into his arms, his face burying into the crook of her neck. Sana could feel him shaking. The most powerful man in Seoul was vibrating with the sheer terror of almost losing her. I've got you, he breathed, his voice raw and broken. "I've got you, Sana. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sana pulled back, her hands framing his face. She saw the blood on his cheek, the sweat on his brow, and the absolute, terrifying devotion in his eyes. She realized then that the Viper's wrath wasn't something to fear. It was the most honest expression of love she had ever known. "You came for me," she whispered. "I will always come for you," he promised, kissing her forehead with a desperate intensity. "I will burn every city in this world until there is nowhere left for you to be afraid." The aftermath of the shipyard was a silent, surgical purge. Within 48 hours, the syndicate had been restructured in blood, and the name Jai-hoon was erased from the city's memory. But while the underworld trembled, the atmosphere inside the Taejun estate changed. It was no longer a golden cage, it was a sanctuary. The Viper had come home, but he had brought the fire with him, and there was one final debt that needed to be settled. Sana stood in the center of the grand drawing room, her deep brown skin glowing against a gown of midnight blue silk. She looked at her reflection, seeing a woman she barely recognized. The fear that had once defined her eyes had been replaced by a calm, cold clarity. Beside her, Taejun adjusted the cuffs of his suit, his gaze lingering on her through the mirror. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a low, supportive hum. "I've been ready since the day they sold me," Sana replied. They didn't go to a warehouse this time. They went to the very house Sana had grown up in, the one her uncle had reclaimed using the first payment from the marriage contract. Elias and his family were celebrating, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses audible from the street. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully traded a niece for a lifetime of luxury. The front door didn't just open. It was removed from its hinges by two of Taejun's silent, towering guards. The music stopped. The laughter died. Elias stood at the head of the dinner table, a glass of expensive wine halfway to his lips. His face went from flushed to ghostly pale as Taejun walked into the room, his presence instantly draining the warmth from the air. But it wasn't Taejun who commanded the space, it was the woman on his arm. "Sana," her aunt gasped, clutching a pearl necklace that Sana recognized as one her mother used to wear. Sana stepped forward, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. She didn't look like an orphan, she looked like a judge. "I told you I wouldn't do it, Uncle. I told you I wasn't property." Elias began to stammer, his eyes darting toward Taejun, looking for a way to bargain. "Sana, sweetheart, we did it for you. Look at you. You're wearing diamonds. We gave you a better life." Taejun's hand moved to the back of Sana's chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes lethal. "You didn't give her anything," he interrupted, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You stole her grief, her home, and her dignity. You treated my wife like a commodity, and now I've come to collect the interest." With a snap of Taejun's fingers, a man in a legal suit stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "Every cent you used to buy back this house, every luxury you've purchased in the last month, it all came from accounts linked to the syndicate," the lawyer stated. "And since those accounts were involved in a conspiracy to kidnap the wife of Lee Taejun, all assets have been seized. As of 5 minutes ago, Elias Vance, you own nothing, not even the clothes on your back." Elias collapsed into his chair. "You can't do this. We're family." "Family doesn't sell family," Sana said, her voice ringing out with a strength that made her uncle flinch. She walked over to her aunt and reached out, her fingers closing around the pearl necklace. With a sharp tug, the string snapped, and the pearls scattered across the floor like tiny white tears. "This belonged to my mother. You don't deserve to touch her memory." Taejun stepped up behind Sana, his hand resting possessively on her waist. "You have 1 hour to vacate. If you are still on this property by midnight, you won't be going to a shelter. You'll be going to the shipyard." The threat was clear. The family scrambled, weeping and shouting, grabbing whatever they could as they were escorted out by the guards. They were left on the sidewalk in the rain, the same rain they had forced Sana to stand in just weeks before. Sana stood in the middle of her childhood home, but she didn't feel the weight of the past anymore. She felt light. She turned to find Taejun watching her, his expression one of profound, quiet pride. "Is it enough?" he asked. Sana looked at the man who had burned the world to keep her safe, the man who had obsessed over every detail of her life until he became her life. She walked into his arms, pressing her face against his chest. "It's more than enough," she whispered. The story ended not with a debt paid, but with a new empire built. Santa Whitmore was no longer the orphan girl who was forced to marry a monster. She was the queen of the Viper's throne, and as they walked out of the house together, leaving the ashes of her old life behind, she knew that for as long as she lived, she would never be afraid again. Because the most dangerous man in Korea didn't just love her, he belonged to her.